Okay. Welcome everyone. Good morning. Thanks for joining this session. My name is Riccardo Crescenzi. I am a professor of economic geography at the LSE, and I will be your host for this session. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to this session on evidence-based recovery, learning what works from evaluation. I would like to take this opportunity to thank our co-organizers that jointly organized this event with the Department of Geography and Environment at the LSE, the Rossi Doria Center at the University of Roma Tre, with the support of the Deeply project that has been mentioned in the introductory section. But let me thank our co-organizers on behalf of the LSE and our department. It is really a great honor and a pleasure to welcome an incredible lineup of speakers for this morning's session. We have with us Eric von Breska, who is the director of the Recovery and Resilience Task Force at the Secretary General of the European Commission. And Eric will offer, with his keynote, an introduction to the Recovery Fund and what the Recovery Fund is trying to achieve, discussing a specific example. You will have all received in your email some introductory material together with your credentials, so you can access, using that link, a background material and some papers discussing the link between the Recovery Fund and cohesion policy in particular. Eric, like I said, will offer a first introduction to the Recovery Fund, and in particular to discuss how the Recovery Fund can learn from existing evaluations of what works and what doesn't. Veronica Gaffey will follow Eric and discuss key lessons from cohesion policy evaluation, and will make the point that even if the Recovery Fund needs to spend quickly, then we should not only look into absorption. It's incredibly important to understand more in depth what are the tools that work in practice. Veronica is the chair of the European Commission's Regulatory Scrutiny Board. That is an independent board tasked with examining the quality of the evidence and the clarity and logic of a presentation in Commission services impact assessments for future proposals and major evaluations. So she is in an ideal position to contribute to this policy learning exercise, linking evaluation with new thinking about new policies and how they should take on board lessons from existing tools. Finally, the floor will be for the final keynote with Harry Overman, a colleague from the LSE. Harry is a professor of economic geography in the Department of Geography and Environment at the LSE, but is also the director of the What Works Center for Local Economic Growth, on top of being the director of the Center for Economic Performance at the LSE. And Harry, with his experience as director of the What Works Center, will discuss also from both a practical and an academic perspective the importance of understanding what works for the design of effective policies. And it will also cover the importance of having institutional tools that embed the understanding of what works into current policymaking. So our keynote speakers will have 20 minutes each for their keynote, and then we will let them discuss, and we will take questions from the audience using the chat function. So I will present the question to our keynotes with the objective of engaging in a dynamic and interactive debate. The key lessons from this keynote session will then feed into the roundtable that will take place this afternoon, that will discuss further the ideas presented in this keynote session, and will offer further reflections on how the ideas discussed on the Recovery Fund and the role of evaluation can feed into cohesion policy. So we'll cover more about the recovery fund today and link these ideas this morning, and then link these ideas with cohesion policy and discuss how the cohesion fund can or cannot interact with cohesion policy in the roundtable this afternoon. So without further ado, let me leave the floor to Eric von Breska. Eric, thanks. The floor is yours.
Good morning, colleagues. First of all, thank you, Riccardo and team for inviting me to this workshop. I'm very, very happy to be here and present to you briefly a new instrument, so the Recovery and Resilience Facility, which is indeed brand new because it didn't exist 12 months ago. And it was created by the heads of state, in fact, as a response to the COVID crisis and to support, in fact, the economic recovery of the European Union. In my view, it's a groundbreaking instrument for two reasons. The first one is, let's say, on the revenue side, if I may say so, because we are now allowed for the first time to go to the financial markets and borrow money and basically pass on this money to the member states, which I mean is new, which was not possible for the European Commission since the European Community or Union has been founded. But also the instrument as such, the recovery facility, has a number of features which I think are not known around the world, and I will explain them to you in a second. And in fact, the way how I wanted to present and explain this to you is based on a case study, because I think the best way to explain things is if you are concrete. And I have prepared a few slides for you, which I will share, or in fact, Riccardo, I think, has to share with you because I had a bit of a problem with my IT equipment this morning. But before doing so, I would want to say a few words about the theoretical foundations, because this is an academic seminar, and obviously before you jump into practice, you first go back to theory. And I think, I mean, you know this much better than I do, but I would assume that that most economic development policies, like cohesion policy, but also like the recovery facility, are based, in fact, on economic growth theory. And you certainly know that when you look at let's say the most prevailing theories, then I mean economic growth is basically the result of a combination of three factors: physical capital, human capital, and innovation. Now, lately, as we all know, there's also a discussion about agglomeration and density, but I will put this for the moment a bit aside. And when you look at cohesion policy, you will obviously see that, I mean, this approach is also true for this particular policy, because the investments in the past have focused on improving infrastructure endowments, or physical capital, to improve quality of human resources, and also to boost the innovative capacity of firms. So I think you see there's a clear link between economic theory and also, let's say, the foundations of cohesion policy. Now, I will not go into the question of the impact, because this, again, I mean, Riccardo and I guess also Henry and others, you have looked into this, and some scientists, as we all know, think there was a quite significant impact. Others say it was not so impactful. I leave this aside for the time being. But I think what is now increasingly clear also for many scientists is that what seems to matter, because it's still not quite clear why some regions or territories take off and you know, go on a positive path while others struggle. I think what is now, I mean, a prevailing consensus, in fact, is that that there is a crucial role of institutions, which seems to matter for economic development. And for the purpose of my presentation, I would say institutions I would define as quality of government. And this matters because this is, in my view, the most fundamental difference between cohesion policy on the one hand and the recovery facility on the other. Because cohesion policy is in fact only about investment, while the recovery facility is also about improving the quality of institutions and of government. Because the focus of the recovery facility is not on investments. So there will be a lot of investment, don't get me wrong. The focus is in fact on reforms. And as we all know, I mean, reforms sometimes they don't cost a penny. It's just that you need to, for example, change a piece of legislation. But we obviously know that this has high political costs, sometimes high social costs, and therefore, while probably most governments know what they are supposed to do, they are afraid to go down that road. So this, I think, is the fundamental difference between the two. And again, I think it's a crucial lesson learned, I would say, that you need to also look at the quality of institutions for economic development policies to work. The second big difference is the focus on investments. I mean, we also under the recovery facility are obviously interested in innovation. But I think with the recovery facility, we have a much stronger focus on the EU policy objectives. And as you probably know, there are two. The first one is to make Europe carbon neutral by 2050. And we all know, I mean, you just need to open the newspapers, that this will be a gigantic transformation, which will obviously have tremendous costs and investment needs. So there's a strong focus on climate, in climate-related reforms and investments in the recovery facility. And the other big, let's say, thing is obviously to make the economy more competitive by digitalizing it, because you probably have heard that the Commission has just issued a communication on the digital decade. So clearly what we would want to push and promote is the digitalization of public administration, of economy, and so on. So this is, I think, the second difference, but it's clearly not as big as the first one, because the first one I find more fundamental. And the last issue I wanted to raise as a fundamental difference is the delivery mechanism. Cohesion policy, like in fact all other policies around the world, to my knowledge, is based on costs. So basically the way how public administrations work is you launch an investment project, you get some bills, and then you pay the bills. And then you're covered because you know that, that the money has been spent, and then you reimburse the costs to the project promoter. This is different in the recovery facility because it's performance-based. And performance-based means what needs to be achieved are certain milestones and targets which are completely independent from costs. And I already mentioned to you the question of reforms. Changing a piece of legislation may not cost you a penny, but it, as I said, it may be fundamental for changing, let's say, the economic trajectory of a country. And to my knowledge, the only policy, at least I'm aware of, which or instrument which is pursuing a similar approach, so performance-based, is in fact run by the World Bank, because they have a program which is called Program Focused on Results. And as you can see already from the name, it's focused on results and it's not focused on cost. And so it's a bit similar. So here we have something which goes a bit in the same direction, but it's only used in a let's say small number of countries, at least to my knowledge. So I think these are for me the three main differences. And now I would just present to you, and if Riccardo could help me right now, a case to explain to you how we go about, or how we went about, in fact, this issue. And the case is Italy. And why did I choose Italy? And Riccardo, if you can go to the next slide, please. I chose Italy because it is by far the biggest plan. So the Italian authorities had to prepare a recovery plan, which then had to be assessed by the Commission, and which was in fact a few months ago approved by the Council of the EU. And you see that this plan amounts to almost 200 billion euro. It's the biggest plan, I think, ever launched in the history of the Union for a country. I mean, just to give you comparison, I think Italy benefits in the period 21-27 from roughly 40 billion euro of cohesion funding. So here we speak 5 times the amount. So it's gigantic in terms of size. It's by far the biggest plan. And you see it's a mix of grants and loans. So some of the money will have to be paid back by Italy over, not over the next few years, but this will obviously be spread out over many, many years. And what you see here, and therefore I have circled it in red, is you see there are many investments, but you also see there are almost 60 reforms. And this is this new feature, which you will not see in any other policy or any other instrument which the European Union is running. And there you see also that these 190 measures, so you see it's reforms plus investments, they are not broken down in terms of costs which need to be achieved, but what needs to be achieved are 525 milestones and targets. This is the performance-based aspect in order for Italy to get reimbursed by the Commission. Well, in fact, it needs to be agreed with Council, but the Commission will have to make the assessment whether the milestones and targets have in fact been fulfilled or not. So this just to explain to you a bit the Italian plan. And now comes the first question, and if Riccardo could go to the next slide, is obviously how do you convince a country that it should carry out reforms, one, to improve its quality of institutions or quality of government, and how do you pick the reforms? Because obviously there are so many reforms needs, probably in many countries, you need to focus. And the only way, at least in the European Union, how this works is by relying on something which has been agreed at the highest level. And what has been agreed in the context of the European semester are the so-called country-specific recommendations. So each member state, usually each year, but there were no CSRs as we call them this year, is subject to a set of recommendations. And these recommendations are adopted by Council. So it's the entirety of the member states which address certain recommendation to one other member state. So it is the only, let's say, legitimate basis which we can use to convince member states that they need to do something. And in fact, why were we able to convince member states to embark on these reforms? We were able because the regulation requires member states as a precondition for the approval of their plan to address these country-specific recommendations. So if member states say, no, I'm not going to do this, then we would have said, well, then no, there will not be a plan. So there will be no financing. And sorry, I just need to take a sip of water. I've here shown to you 4 country-specific recommendations. I will, in fact, only mention now 2, the second one and the fourth one, because I think we all agree that one of the problems in Italy is the lack of efficiency and effectiveness of the public sector, of the public administration, 1, but 2, also of the judiciary. Because at the end of the day, also the justice system has quite an important impact, in fact, on, let's say, economic development. So there is a country-specific recommendation which to address to Italy that it needs to do something about it. And you also see that because, as we know, one of the problems of Italy is that there was a lack of growth for many, many, many years. And to a large extent, this was also related to the business environment. And therefore, there's another country-specific recommendation where Italy is asked to improve its business environment, in particular by removing obstacles to competition. So these are just 2. There are, as I said, there are 4 of them, but I will just focus on these 2. And if you go now to the next slide, please, Riccardo, you see here that we have addressed and discussed, obviously, the related reforms. And you will see these are all reforms. These are, well, there is also some investment, but these are in particular reforms. And you see, for example, if I go to the bottom left, that one of the measures to which Italy has committed itself is to reform the public employment of its public administration. So the way how civil servants will be recruited, trained, how they need to be mobile, how they need to need to be trained, will all be reviewed and changed. There are also some other measures here. We have also, for example, education reform. You see where the teaching profession will also be reviewed and revised, because we think that it's not only the quality of the education to a large extent depends on the quality of teachers. And you see on the right-hand side that there are also a number of reforms which will have to be carried out in the justice sector and also concerning public finance. I will not go into this right now, but I think what is very important, and this is also, I think, something on which we were insisting, these reforms, they need to take place early on. So the sequence should be, first you carry out the reforms, and then you do the spending. So first you want to improve the quality of the administration, and then you hope at least that with an improved quality of administration, you will also be able to run more successful investment policies. And the way how we have done it is that we have set the milestones and targets, which I mentioned before, early on. So we have agreed with the Italian government that one of the first things which they need to do is to improve the judiciary. One of the first things which they need to do is to improve the public administration. And then we have targets for investments, which cover the later period of the recovery facility, which goes until 2026. Next slide, please. Yes, and here I just wanted to, again, because I mentioned it before, you see improving the business environment. And what we have indeed agreed here with the Italian authorities, among others, is that they will have to pass legislation, and you see it's called annual competition laws, which are going to improve, remove bottlenecks, which are going to improve the business environment. And I will, at the end, explain to you a bit what this concretely means. But again, you see that we have insisted that the business environment reforms, they need to be front-loaded, because we want first to improve the business environment, and then, in fact, this to be complemented by implementation. Next slide, please. Here you see our focus on climate. So basically, concerning the investments, we again, this is legally anchored. The countries are obliged to put a heavy emphasis on climate-related investments. And you see some on the bottom left, energy efficiency in residential buildings. So this is basically renovation, sustainable mobility, and so on and so forth. But again, I want to underline on the right-hand side that they are also, again, they are accompanied by reforms. It's not only investment. And for example, what you see here is, well, I can hardly see it because I cannot see what is happening on the right side of the screen. But for example, we have agreed with the Italian authorities that the water management needs to be improved, because there's a lot of illegal extraction. There's a lot of waste of water because there's no incentive because the prices do not reflect, let's say, the demand. So that there need to be also reforms in this area. Waste management needs to be improved, and so on. Next slide, please. Second investment focus, I mentioned to you at the beginning, the two, climate and digital. Same here, you see on the left-hand side the types of investments which are enshrined right now in the Italian plan. You see we're covering many things: public administration, businesses, connectivity, 5G, and so on. You also see on the right-hand side that there are some reforms. And what is also very important, and this I also would like to mention, is that with the recovery facility, we have insisted that we want cross-border projects, so that to really make sure that there's a European dimension. And you see that also in the Italian plan, there are a number of multi-country projects where also other countries participate. in order to bring along the digital transformation. Next slide, please. And I think this is the last one. Sorry. I mentioned at the beginning that the third big difference is the performance-based nature of the recovery facility. So we are not paying against bill. We are paying against, you see, specific milestones and targets. They are set out here, and the first ones are linked to reforms, the first three ones. And I just want to take one concrete example. One of the problems, and I'm referring here to the justice system, is that Italy has a quite big backlog of old cases, court cases, which are pending for years and years and years on the one hand, and also that, let's say, the proceedings as such, they are very, very long as compared to European average. And so basically what we have agreed with the Italian authorities is that they need to reduce the length of these proceedings and also of the court cases by a certain percentage at all instances. And only if this objective is met, they will be reimbursed. So again, you see, this is not about spending money, it's about meeting certain targets. And then, and because I just wanted to also leave you with two examples of investments, because the first three on top are related to the reforms. And you see again, business environment, they will need to, the Italian authorities need to change the legislation to reduce this time to set up a business, to make the public service contracts more competitive, because right now this is always in-house awards, which are economically not efficient, in particular in the waste, but also in the transport sector. And this will end, I think, in 2024, 2025. So there's a commitment from Italy to change this and to make this more competitive, these procedures. But then, as I said, I also have at the bottom two or three, well, in fact, four targets which Italy needs to achieve related to investments. And you see the first two, sustainable mobility and renewables, are linked to our climate agenda. So Italy will, for example, be reimbursed if indeed it creates 200 megawatts of offshore, I think it's wind offshore renewables, but also if it builds in the timeline of the recovery facility more than 500 kilometers of high-speed rail. And you see on the bottom that there are also some targets for digital, so for connectivity of schools and households and so on. So this is a bit, in a nutshell, how the recovery facility is supposed to operate. So again, it's based on milestones and targets, which cover both reforms and investment. Now, the big question, obviously, and this is how I would want to conclude my presentation, is this all feasible? Because we obviously all know that let's say Italy doesn't have the best track record in terms of implementing EU funds. It's going to be a big challenge. There's no doubt about it. Once again, what may help us is the fact that a lot of the money which the European Union will provide to Italy is in fact not linked to investments. So in fact, there is no relationship between the costs on the one hand and the disbursement which Italy will receive on the other. And this may help. And as I said, if the Italian government is now indeed progressing quickly with these changes, business environment, judiciary, public administration, it will obviously help them to absorb a significant chunk of money. Because again, this is the focus of the recovery facility. It's not so much the investments, it's much more the reforms, because we want to improve, as I said at the beginning, the quality of institutions. And I think I stop here and thank you for the attention.
Eric, thank you so much for this fascinating talk. We have a boiling chat with many questions being asked, but I will leave the floor immediately to Veronica, who I'm sure will address some of the issues when I know I will address some of the issues that are being asked by our audience in her keynote, but and then we'll have time for debate later. Please keep using the chat to send your questions. Veronica, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Riccardo, and thank you very much for the invitation to come and talk to you this morning. It's been very interesting so far. I've learned a lot from listening to Eric about the focus of the Recovery and Resilience facility. And I think from what I hear, it very much tries to tackle some of the weaknesses that have been established in cohesion policy. But I still think there are some challenges, and we need to be aware of them. And I think evaluation gives us some useful lessons, which can help both in cohesion policy, but also help in the implementation of the recovery and resilience programs. I mean, my leitmotif, and I've used it all the time when I worked in evaluation of regional policy, I always said absorption of funds is not enough. I think this is the case here too, but I find very interesting this disconnection between the investments and the disbursements. I think that's an interesting difference, because it's true that cohesion policy has sometimes ended up with too strong a focus on correct expenditure. So correct expenditure, audited expenditure will achieve something, but not necessarily the most that could be achieved. And I think very interesting in this example is about how the reforms should be carried out in the first instance. So yeah, evaluation can help, but what are the conditions for successful evaluation and what are the pitfalls to avoid? So I want to talk first of all about the policymaker's job in evaluation, because I think sometimes the policymaker is too quick to go to the evaluator to say, evaluator, will you please evaluate my program? But there's some very important intellectual work which must be undertaken by the policymaker for evaluation to perform its function. So the first thing I think the policymaker needs to be clear on is what is the need for the intervention? And secondly, how should it work? Thirdly, what is the baseline situation? And fourthly, what would success look like? And I find very interesting the focus of the recovery facility on performance, on the milestones and targets. But if I recall an experience in cohesion policy where there was a performance framework and targets were set, are these the right targets? Do these targets actually measure success? Or do people set targets? Because this is once you set targets, there are incentives which come into play. So there may be some people who set their targets artificially low in order that they know they will achieve them, and others may set their targets too high. So there really is an issue about what is the need for the intervention? How should it work? What is the baseline situation? And what would success look like? And that's the policymaker's job to establish, not the evaluator's job. I mean, if I think back to an example from my days in regional policy, when we were looking at outcome indicators, we went and visited a number of regions. We took an example of urban regeneration, and I sat in a room with people responsible for the policy, and people around the table all had entirely different ideas of what this policy should achieve. Some people thought it was more inhabitants, some people thought it was more tourism, some people thought it was greater safety. So I think this is an important aspect for policymakers. I think there needs to be clarity on the data that will be needed. This should inform the quantified baseline and the targets that are set. It should be clear who is responsible for reporting data and in what way, so periodicity and measurement units, and we must automate as much as possible. And I think with this, the current focus on digitalization, I think this is absolutely crucial. I've had experience in the past where in evaluation, you spend a lot of money on gathering data and extracting it from paper documents when, if with a bit of thought up front, it could have been made easily accessible for the evaluator. Another very important point is that policymakers are open to learn about weaknesses and the potential to improve policies. So without these elements, it's difficult for evaluation to reconstruct these aspects at a later stage. For me, evaluation is primarily about learning what works and why. Good evaluation can play an important role in institutional learning. It also contributes, of course, to accountability and communicating what has been achieved with public funds and how that impact could be enhanced. There is an important difference between the Recovery and Resilience Facility and cohesion policy in that the facility is once off. Cohesion policy takes place in successive multi-annual programming periods with evaluation built in at various stages. It should be, and sometimes is, the ultimate learning policy. But that is, I think, an area where probably evaluation can still contribute more. So if I say a little bit about the challenges for evaluation that I see through my work, where we review now the evaluations undertaken by the Commission, but you will be familiar with these challenges for other evaluations and in evaluation of the Recovery and Resilience Fund. I'm sure these challenges will come up too. First of all, the data issue, I referred to that already. Cohesion policy provides an example with common indicators, and I think this is going to be something that is going to feature in the Recovery and Resilience Facility too. But so if, as noted earlier, the data gathering is well planned from the beginning, the data will be available for the evaluator, but it's important that we don't just talk about outputs, but we also look at what the outcomes to be achieved as well. For evaluation, the timing of evaluation is a crucial issue, and this is something we might reflect a little bit about for the Recovery and Resilience programs, plans. When would be the best time to evaluate them? For cohesion policy, it's been a challenge. Often midterm evaluations take place before any results have been achieved. In my view, cohesion policy has been handicapped by the N+2 or 3 rule, whereby evaluations were planned too early. And even worse, I feel programs designed and approved maybe 3 years before they actually start, with the result that conditions may actually have changed by the time you start implementing the program. And I think this is something that, from Eric's presentation, it seems to me that is overcome for the recovery and resilience plans. Yeah, as I outlined earlier, we see many evaluations where the rationale for the intervention and how it was supposed to work are not explicit or are not logical. And I think this is an important issue for us to reflect on. Okay, for evaluation, I think a challenge is openness and transparency on the strengths and weaknesses of the methods that are used. There can be a variety of problems here. Sometimes we see evaluators who are very much wedded to their method. We see this particularly with the use of models, which should be transparent on the assumptions made. Where there is uncertainty, sensitivity analysis should be undertaken. It's important to triangulate and bring together evidence from different sources. In European Commission evaluations, stakeholder consultations can be an important source of evidence, but the analysis of such consultations must be done in a way that takes account of minority and dissenting views. Stakeholder consultations are not a poll. So another issue that I'd like to mention as a challenge for evaluation is that impacts for whom. So it's important that evaluations are clear about who benefits from policies. How do benefits of spending programs impact different income groups, different sectors, SMEs, territories, rural and urban, and member states? Quantification of these benefits is important, but even when not possible, a qualitative analysis can feed reflection on the effectiveness of policy. Further challenge that we see is biased conclusions and selective reading of the evidence. So different incentives can be at work here. For the policymaker, he or she may not want to give profile to the weaknesses that are identified. For the evaluator, he or she may wish to please the client and therefore may tone down the conclusions, and partly because they want to get the next contract. I mean, we all know this is what can happen. From my experience on the Regulatory Scrutiny Board, we spot these cases because we do read the whole evaluation. We don't just read the conclusions, we read the underlying studies, and we see when the underlying evidence is not reflected in the conclusions. So the final thing I'd like to talk about is to talk about the Recovery and Resilience Fund is massive. It must make a difference, and the biggest difference it can, to deliver for EU citizens. And I think from what Eric has presented, we see about it's been constructed in a way to maximize the chances of it making a real difference for EU citizens. So I think learning from evaluations of cohesion policy can help in the design and the delivery of the recovery and resilience plans. Cohesion policy has invested in green and digital policies already, so there are lessons there which can be pulled out. So it's important for member states to look at what their cohesion policy evaluations tell them about what is effective. And I would say to a lot of the people who are in the audience for this event, it's important for evaluators, particularly academics, to present the evidence that exists to feed into the process. And it's very appropriate that you organize, Riccardo, that you organize this event now, because I think the time to come forward with this evidence is now, and to feed that into the process. So I finish my presentation there and look forward to the ongoing discussion. Thanks a lot, Riccardo.
Thank you, Veronica. Thanks for your enlightening talk. You touched upon a number of very important issues that I'm sure are very close to the interests of many people in the room, and they match some of the questions also that have been asked. Let me leave immediately the floor to Henry for his keynote. I'm sure Henry will also discuss the practical experience also of the What Works Center in this area. Thank you, Henry. The floor is yours.
Right, can you see my slides, Riccardo? Give me a nod if you can.
Yes.
Yeah, perfect. Okay. So I actually agree with a lot of what Veronica and Eric have said. And the way I've structured my talk, the first part is really going to address some of the challenges Veronica has raised. And then I'm going to come back right at the very end and just touch a little bit on some of the points that Eric made about the importance of institutions. So that's roughly how I've set it up. Let me talk first about the evidence and evaluation channel. Now, Veronica puts this much more politely as about absorption. You know, let me say this. You know, when we are trying to shovel money out of the door, it is difficult to get evidence and evaluation embedded into the policy-making process. Now, with something like the Recovery Fund, or any of the recovery funds, I mean, this is nothing that's specific to the Commission's policies. It's understandable, you know, that we've been trying to do this fast, right? We're responding to a crisis. But actually, this point is much more general because, to be honest, you know, people on the call who have experience of actually trying to get policies out the door will know this. There nearly always comes a point when you're trying to shuffle the money out the door. And so actually, although, you know, this is a comment that I would make particularly about funds that are introduced in a crisis, I actually think that, you know, it just holds much more generally. There comes a point in the development of nearly every local growth policy that I've been involved with where officials start to get very worried about how they're going to get the money out to programs and projects, and then how they're going to ensure that the programs and projects actually spend that money within the financial window. So I think this is a major challenge. And I wanted to just reflect a little bit on how the What Works approach.
Harry, can you get closer to the mic?
Yeah, can you hear me better now?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, okay, sorry, it's sitting underneath my shirt collar. So let me tell you a little bit about how the What Works approach tries to deal with the evidence challenge, the evaluation challenge. Then I'll talk just a little bit about some of the specific challenges I see for recovery fund type evaluation, and then I'll conclude and I'll look forward to the chat. So one of the things that we try to do with the What Works approach, and this comes back to something Veronica said, is we try to make sure that we've systematically summarized the evidence as much as possible before the policy debates are happening about how we're going to spend the money. And the emphasis here is on trying to be systematic in the evidence that we are summarizing. This is the sort of diagram I put up about the What Works approach. I'm just going to talk at first about the sort of one that goes from evidence reviews and reviewing evidence round to an understanding of what works. And then I'm going to come back and go around the top loop and talk about demonstration projects and evaluation and its role in improving our understanding of what works. And then the third part, I'm just going to come to actually how we translate that into policy. So the reason I think why you have to do this work up front is and Veronica sort of said this, is, you know, if you're going to be systematic, there's a lot of work to do in going through the evidence and pulling it together in a way that is useful for policymakers. So I'll just give you a feeling here for what we've done when we do these things. You know, we have a scoping process which pulls together academic panel and users to figure out, you know, what we should be looking at. We then have to search through the literature. We've then got to sift and refine to get the impact evaluations. Now, we adopt an approach where we score impact evaluations to figure out which ones we think we should be placing more emphasis on, less emphasis on. And then we've got to summarize all of this in a way that is both transparent to academics and others that produce evaluations, but that is also useful to the policymaker who might not be an expert and needs to understand what the evaluations are telling them. And this is not something you do overnight, you know, so this is something we've got to build in and have ready up front for people to look at. Now, I said that we score stuff. And let me just talk for a quick moment here about what I mean about impact evaluation, because this is going to be important in a point I'm going to make about what we know about what works and the evidence that is available to policymakers. So when I say impact evaluation, I am looking for something which basically says, what is the change in outcome for those in the program? So that could be people, places, firms. And I'm looking for a comparison group, a change in outcome for those not in the program. And the reason why I think this is so crucial is two things. Firstly, the economy gets hit by lots of other shocks, and firms and places get hit by lots of other things. So if we want to condition those out, we've got to have some kind of comparison group. This, by the way, is a major issue that I'm going to come back to in thinking about how we evaluate the recovery fund type interventions. The other thing here is that we know that there's lots of selection into treatment. If you take, for example, the work I've done on regional selective assistance, so the financial assistance that the UK government used to give to firms in assisted areas in the UK, if you just take the firms that get the money and do before and after, you know, their performance is worse after they get the grant than the broad body of firms. But of course, that's to be expected because they're precisely selected into treatment because they are firms that are struggling. And what we really need is a set of firms that were similarly struggling, but who we didn't support to figure out whether the money made a difference. And when we do that, the effect of giving that money to them is positive, at least on employment. Okay, and I think this is a really, this is a really crucial lesson. Now, why am I taking time to highlight this? Why I'm taking time to highlight this is that there is a big gap between things that say they're impact evaluations and things that provide a comparison group that would allow us to get them into our What Works evidence reviews. So I've highlighted here, if you look at this is each of the evidence reviews we did in an 18-month cycle. The first column is the studies which claim to do impact evaluation. So that's hash studies. And then the second column of numbers, which is SMS3, says how many of those had a before and after and a comparison group. Right, so you see, if you say something like access to finance, which is something that we really like, there are 1,450 studies out there across the OECD that claim to do impact evaluations. Only 27 of these have a comparison group to allow us to get them into our evidence reviews. Now, you might ask what the other 1,450 do. It's a mix. So some of this is process evaluation, which is actually hugely valuable. It is figuring out, like, when you ring up the service, does someone answer the phone and tell you how to get access to the money? And this is going to come back to a point Eric made about the role of institutions, and etc. Quite a lot of this is, there's a huge amount of case study work by academics, which is looking at one particular success or failure. I personally just don't find this very useful, because there's just always something idiosyncratic about one particular success or failure, which means that I struggle to learn systematic lessons for it that I can pass on to other policy makers. And the third thing is central and local governments saying how brilliant they are. And how amazing it is and how much they've done with all of the money that they've been given. And this is never very informative, I'm afraid, on, whether we've actually had an impact. So I think, there's a real challenge here about how we produce more of this impact evaluation evidence. So I'm going to put my emphasis on this impact evaluation evidence and its role in policy making. That's not to say the other stuff isn't important, the process, the monitoring. It's just reflecting the fact that we've got a huge imbalance here. We've got much more of the process, monitoring type style of evaluation, and much less on the what works sort of style of saying, okay, do we really know what's working? By the way, you see I've got EU down the bottom here, and the EU ones that I have here are really looking at the overall impact of EU funds. If we have EU evaluations that are on specific elements like access to finance, etc., they'd be in the top half of this table, because we obviously would have pulled them in to learn about specific interventions. So one of the things we always get at this point is people saying, oh, you're setting the bar too high. Now, funnily enough, that bar is roughly what you would struggle to publish in an economics journal without meeting that bar, right? So, it is a useful bar for thinking about when the academic community starts to think we are really getting at identifying the impact of policy here. But I think as a policymaker, it's actually a fair criticism to say, Veronica picked up on this, well, what if there's other things we could be learning about literature that doesn't do that? And we have tried to address this by being more liberal once we get to thinking about the impacts of specific elements of policy. So if we're asking, does employment training, business advice, access to finance work? Then, we look for these impact evaluations which have a control group. When we go down to the design level, we actually relax the evidence standards a bit and say, okay, well, now let's imagine I'm a policymaker and I'm trying to design an employment training program. What do we have in terms of evidence on whether careers counselling, financial incentives, pre-qualifications, reminding people about courses? What do we know about the individual design elements? And there we relax the evidence standards. But I have to say that what you discover there is a slightly different challenge, which is you still can't find much literature because a lot of that knowledge is embedded in organisations and they're not very transparent, as Veronica said, about what they know about the effectiveness of specific components of your programme. So, in some ways, you'd think it would broaden out the evidence base substantially, but actually summarizing that as an outsider is very, very difficult because most of this stuff lives in actually delivery organizations, and they're not open and transparent about what they're learning, about whether their spend is effective, for reasons that I suppose are blindingly obvious, which is that no one wants to admit that they've tried something which is ineffective. And most places want to say they're doing stuff which is effective. So we have this selection bias that Veronica talked about. So I don't want to say this is all doom and gloom. For those of you on the call who are in policy making and trying to decide what works, I encourage you to go and look at the evidence reviews and toolkits. There's a big resource there. For those of you who are academics, I encourage you to go and look at it because we've done your literature reviews for you. And you can go and have a look and see what's out there. And I'd encourage people, if you spot things where you have evaluations that are missing, we have a rolling process of updating when people provide us with these studies, or at least we look periodically. So, send us stuff if you think you've got stuff that meets our evidence standards that aren't there. So now let me just briefly flip to the other side of the thing, which says, well, look, you know, it's fine for us to criticize policymakers for not using the evidence, but actually there's not a lot of impact evaluation evidence for them to draw on always, or if there is, it's not summarized in ways that are helpful to them. And here I just want to briefly talk about evaluation. So I want to head down the other side of this arch around what we do on evaluation. Now, I don't really want to say a lot here because I thought what Veronica had to say was excellent. And like I said, I agree with lots of it. But one thing that I did want to reflect on is the timing. So actually, and this perhaps is a point of disagreement, a slight disagreement that we could come to in the discussion. I actually think that you need to do evaluations both early on in the cycle and at a point where you could reasonably expect the policy impacts to emerge. And I think that those two things need to be integrated into one another. The point about doing them during the implementation of the policy is, if you can, to change course if it's not working. So one of the things that we put a lot of emphasis on is how do we get early intervention? And when you talk to politicians, they mean Q1. You know, Q1 is when they start asking about the effect of their policy. You know, they're 3 months in, 9 months in, a year. I just think as evaluators, we can't be saying to them, no, you've got to wait. I actually think the evaluation community has got to say, this is what I can tell you now. This is what I'll tell you immediately when the program finishes. And this is what I will tell you 3 years after the program has completed. The other thing, Veronica, you sort of did mention this briefly as well. You have to get the timing of when you're designing the evaluation right. So it's not 3 years before, but it's not 3 years after. It is actually really at the stage where you're thinking about the delivery mechanism. And that, of course, is why it is so challenging, because it's precisely at the crunch point where you're trying to get the money out the door that you need to be thinking about the monitoring and evaluation framework that you're going to put in place, because those two things need to inform one another. If you end up with a policy that looks completely different to what you were planning, you end up in trouble. So let me just briefly finish, Riccardo, with just a couple of reflections then on the specific challenges for the Recovery Fund. One challenge, I think, is that when you shovel money out the door and you've got to get the spend out there, there's just a tendency to revert to that, well, we'll evaluate it after it's been running for 18 months a year, because, you know, we're all at capacity, we've got to get the money out. And then I still think we get a lot from that, but we don't get the ability to reorientate the policy as we're going along. And I think that's, you know, something interesting to reflect on. The other thing comes from something Veronica said in our pre-meet on this, which is, she said, often what we get is, well, we can't really pick up the effects of policy because the spend's too small. And the amazing thing with what we're just about to see is we're going to spend a lot of money. Now, that's great, but of course, from my perspective, the problem is that when everyone's getting money, how do I make the comparisons to think about whether I'm making a difference? And, you know, we're having ongoing discussions with the British government about, you know, how we think about what their access to finance initiatives have done when a huge proportion of eligible firms have taken out support from the scheme. And I think these are major challenges. Let me just finish. I said I would come back to Eric's point. One of the big failures I had as an early career academic here, and actually until I really started doing the What Works Centre in 2013, was that I thought once we got to that box labelled understanding what works, our job was done. And Eric really made this very clear. Our job is far from done, because the crucial thing there is that we need the institutions in place to turn that into more effective policy making. And so I think it's great to hear Eric talking about the institutions that they're putting in place in public employment as part of the fund to try and make a difference and take, you know, because you can have as much understanding of what works as you want, but if you don't recognize the capacity issues and the political issues that decision makers make, it's not going to translate into more effective policy. So I think that, you know, events like today are great for, you know, I think they're part of the solution here in trying to make this link from an understanding of what works to more effective policy. But I also think that the emphasis that the Commission and others are placing on trying to sort out major institutional issues will also get us a long way in improving the link between an understanding of what works and more effective policy implementation.
Thank you, Henry. That's been incredibly insightful and helpful. We have lots of questions, as you might have seen in the chat and as you can imagine. And I'm sure there are also reactions to from within the panel of our keynote speakers that you may want to discuss. Let me ask a first question that is directed to Eric, and then I will leave him the floor also to respond to some of the ideas that came from Veronica's and Eric's talk. Benoit Dichery in the chat has mentioned the idea that cohesion policy has indeed been trying to address institutional quality and capacity building already with the enlargement, that is the most typical example, the conditionality, the Copenhagen criteria, etc., but also more specific conditionalities linked with the implementation of cohesion policy. He specifically mentioned also the issue on administrative capacity with reference to, for example, bureaucracy, etc., etc. But results, in particular in less developed regions, have not been exciting, to say the least. So I think the question here is how and to what extent we can expect, or on what grounds we can expect the recovery fund and facility to play differently in this regard. And again, a question that comes from cohesion policy experience from Julie Pellegrin. Cohesion policy 2 is trying hard to be performance-based. An interesting fourth feature that characterizes cohesion policy is its place-based nature. So here the question is there, how and to what extent the design of the recovery and resilience facilities taking on board the attempts that, for example, cohesion policy has done to be performance-based, and how and to what extent this has been successful, but also how and to what extent the recovery and resilience facility is going to be place-based, that take into account the fact that there is a huge diversity of conditions within the EU and within member states, and that different regions might have very different capacities. So you discussed the case of Italy. The quality of the public administration in northern Italy is very different vis-a-vis the south. I stop here for now because there are more coming. Thanks, Eric.
Thank you, Riccardo, and thanks very much for these questions. I'm afraid I don't have all the answers. So I would agree that indeed cohesion policy obviously has also contributed to reinforcing, let's say, the administrative capacity of public administrations. I mean, I think, for example, about, until cohesion policy came, I think the whole approach to evaluation, monitoring of policies or investment policies, of capacity building, of exchange of best practice between administration, I think didn't really exist. So I think there were certainly many features where I think cohesion policy can claim that progress has been made in this particular area. I also saw that in the chat a reference was made to the so-called ex-ante conditionalities. But I just want to show to you what the difference is between, let's say, these conditions in cohesion policy to strengthen the administration and what we are doing under the recovery facility. Now, the ex-ante conditionalities, now they are called enabling conditions for 21-27, and they are in principle linked to the sectors of investment. So let's take, for example, transport. So you want to invest in transport. Then what would happen is if you put forward a program with transport infrastructure investments, the question from the Commission would be, do you have a strategy in place, so kind of a master plan, which explains to us that all these different investments, maybe in rail and road and so on, how they all fit together, and it's not just a piecemeal approach. So I would probably say this is a rather soft way of conditionality. So basically you need to present strategies before the Commission approves your plan. Now, if I take the same question, so transport again under the recovery facility, we would probably say, before you get any money, we want you to do a tax reform where, for example, you introduce taxes on polluting cars, or where you introduce a scrapping scheme for old vehicles, or where you, for example, reform your state-owned enterprises, which are usually running road and rail investments, which are in most places super inefficient, loss-making, and where the corporate governance clearly doesn't work. So basically, you see what I mean. So we would only accept investments in the transport sector if quite far-reaching reforms in this sector would occur, which clearly go just, I present you a transport master plan or so. I mean, so I think there is really, you know, like a difference between the two approaches in terms of trying to improve the functioning of public administrations and putting in place, let's say, an environment which is conducive to investment. Now, coming to your second question, the place-based approach. I mean, obviously, I mean, we have, for example, for Italy, there is indeed in the recovery plan of Italy a spending target of 40% foreseen for investments in the south. So 40% of all the investments should, in fact, take place in the south. So you have a bit of, let's call it place-based, even though it's probably not place-based, but still it's a focus on southern Italy. But at the same time, I mean, we should not forget the recovery plans are national plans. You have only one. I mean, as you know, for example, in Italy, basically all the regions have their own program under cohesion policy. So you have one for Sicily, you have one for Campania, and so on. So clearly it's much more place-based than the recovery plan could ever be. Having said that, what is very important for us, and this is one of the things which we are currently discussing, not only with the Italian government, but with all governments, is how do we make sure that stakeholders are sitting at the table and are involved in the implementation. So in fact, in the contract, which we will still sign also with Italy, the question of involvement of stakeholders in the implementation will be one which will be very important to us, and where we will engage into regular exchanges with the regions, for example, in Italy, to ensure that indeed they are also feel an ownership, because many of the investments, and this is my last point here, are in fact going to be implemented by regional or local authorities. Think about hospitals, think about education, think about investment in school and so on, universities. This is not the national you know, like level or a ministry in Rome in the case of Italy, which is in charge. No, it will obviously be also in Italy, according to the responsibilities of the different levels of government, the level of government which is in charge of this particular policy areas. Also for transport, think about urban sustainable transport, or think about metros and so on. I mean, I think all of this is in the hands and will be in the hands of local and regional authorities.
Thanks, Eric, for your replies. I have a question that is both for Veronica and Harry, I think. Eric has placed a lot of emphasis, not Eric, I mean, when discussing the features of the Recovery and Resilience Facility, on institutional quality and how important institutional quality and reforms are for the success of the recovery plan. The academic literature at the same time has spent a lot of ink and paper discussing how important institutional quality is, and it works basically for everything. So better institutional quality is good for things like trade, for social capital, whatever. Now the question for Harry and Veronica is, do we have any evidence that we can actually influence institutional quality? And is there any example of successful programs that have been successful in using public policy to improve institutional quality where it is weak? Or are we in a sort of catch-22 problem whereby we are trying to improve institutional quality, but the bodies in charge of doing this have weak capacity, and therefore these reforms are never implemented? I think this is very important, because member states would also need insights in this regard. I'm a bit worried when I read the newspapers about the Italian case. At the moment, improving the public administration is mostly about hiring people and hiring new people. That works and helps with the electoral cycle, but might not necessarily improve quality, might just improve the quantity of the people involved. Might work well for some of the indicators, but might not necessarily reflect on the experience of the citizens and on the effectiveness of public services. So I wonder if Veronica and Harry can offer us some insights in this regard, and how evaluation can help in this regard. Thank you. Veronica.
Thanks very much, Riccardo. Very interesting question, and I was looking at it in the chat. I mean, I think that from what I listened to Eric, it does seem to me that the Recovery and Resilience Fund is taking a lot of lessons from cohesion policy and responding to them, and doing things in a different way, trying things in a different way. I mean, it's the performance focus, the place-based, etc. But in the end of the day, there's a real challenge. And when I was listening to Eric talking about the need to develop a strategy before you have the investment taking place, I do have some concern that maybe if the institutional quality is not there, that maybe you don't get to the stage of a good quality strategy, which then triggers the investment. So I think we still have a problem, but I mean, we have to try. We have to. I mean, the crisis is such that I think it's important for everybody to do their best to make this a success. In terms of the institutional quality thing, I think that's crucial. If I wanted to take an example, I could take an example of the country I know best in the 1990s when I was still working in Ireland, and at that stage, Ireland was receiving very significant resources from the structural funds, and there were rules that were put in place, and they had an impact on the institutions. And the rules that some of the rules that were put in place were about cost-benefit analysis for major investments. That transformed the planning of major investments in Ireland. There was a learning took place in the administration, because there was a view that this was the chance that Ireland had to really make a difference with the structural funds. Now, one of the points is then that then Ireland got very rich, and maybe it forgot some of that institutional learning. So institutional learning is a kind of an iterative process. And I think it's important that the triggers are there. But if the trigger that seems to me to be there for the recovery and resilience programs is the scale of the resources. So if there's anything that's going to incentivize the institutional learning, it seems to be this. And I think there's a real opportunity there. I'd like maybe that if Eric would maybe tell us a little bit more at some stage about how you plan to evaluate the recovery and resilience programs, or is it the facility as a whole? So maybe you could say a little bit about that. But Henry, I'm sure, wants to come in first.
So I think here's the challenge, I think, is that I think to a broad extent, you know, we know what good quality decision making in these kind of areas looks like, right? So I think that people would be able to. So Veronica mentioned, for example, you know, I do believe in the fact that for we should try and do ex ante appraisals that, you know, that actually specify what the objective of the policy is, and talks about actually, you know, one of the things I would say there is, you know, which we don't get very right, is talks about it both at a strategic level, actually, as much as at a modelling level. You know, I'm not, you know, begging for more transport modellers, to be honest. I'm actually begging for us to sort of say, well, you know, we're going to put a high-speed rail line between, you know, the south and north of England. Really, what do we think the strategic case for this is? So I think that we know how to do that. You know, we know what that should look like. It's how do you get from where you are to a public sector that does these things as a matter of routine? And I think that's where the question's getting at. I think there probably is evidence on things you can do, initiatives, etc., in terms of public sector transformation. We don't summarize them, but I'm sure they're out there. You know, things that people have done that are really, you know, concrete things, you know, about what do we do in terms of educational qualifications or open procurement or whatever, right? Where, you know, you do something and you get a feeling for what it is. Of course, the difficulty is that the politics just gets in the way there. You know, the technocrats, you know, those of us sitting on this call can say this all we like. But actually, there's got to be the political will to implement those things. The other thing I would say, which actually picks back on a bit the place-based issue, is that, you know, we do know from work that people have done. I'm always struck by Sasha Becker, Peter Eggers, and Max van Erlich's work on this. That, you know, the institutional skills really do matter for the effectiveness of the cohesion policy. The challenge that we've got is that I suspect that those two things are closely related to one another. So, you know, when we go out and do place-based stuff in areas which face a GDP and a low skills challenge, they are also going to face the institutional challenge, precisely because, you know, there aren't enough skilled workers to fill the, you know, the local institutions who are making the decisions on these things. So it's always a slightly tricky thing. You know, I'm always in principle in favor of, you know, subsidiarity and getting these things down to the local level in the appropriate decision making. A lot of that discussion ends up about being in principle where we think this decision making should lie. In practice, it's actually a much harder trade-off if we've got institutions locally who just aren't up to making good decisions about what policy should look like.
Thanks, Harry. Yeah, I think here, like, there is also a nice comment on the chat from Duarte Rodriguez suggesting the idea that evaluation itself is an exercise that can improve the quality of government and the effectiveness of policies. I think the key problem is how a culture of evaluation then trickles down the different layers of the civil service, and it's also an issue of education to evaluation, so that people can understand at all levels. There can be a supply of evaluation and demand for that when making public policy decisions. So understanding what a control group is, it's something that we should teach in universities maybe, but that should also be part of the lifelong learning of civil servants. And I think another important issue might be data, on which, with reference to cohesion policy, I mean, we have very good example of open data and access to data that make it possible for all researchers to study and to contribute to this process. The work that we did with Mara Jua on the timely implementation of green and digital projects, that Giulia Sonzogno will present later in the paper session, really was based on the analysis of cohesion policy to be able to say something about green and digital, looking at the past. So also the issue of data, it's something that probably needs to be embedded. We have not seen much in this front with reference, or maybe we will see. So I don't know if Eric can tell us something on how open data will be maybe a requirement for member states. I think on the Italian front, for example, we didn't have very good news because Italy is not going to follow the same approach as for cohesion policy in terms of making data available. I'm referring to Italy not only because I'm Italian, as you might have taken from my accent, but also because it was the case used by Eric. So the first question is on data, because it links also with what Veronica mentioned on spending money to recollect data ex post. I did this a little bit for Veronica some years ago, going on paper documents. It's extremely expensive and sometimes ineffective. So how are we going to address this for the recovery plan? And there is also a question from Alex Kleibrink in the chat on how can we effectively monitor all these targets across so many different member states, given that this is rarely done even within countries. So I think the question from Alex is how can this be done, also taking into account information asymmetries. And like you said, I mean, countries had an incentive even to cook their books in order to be eligible for the EU structural funds or not. So being below or above the threshold for certain regions, I use this case a lot in teaching. Then how about so many different, so we struggle with one, the GDP criteria. How can we monitor all this to make sure that disbursements are then fair across member states in this sense? And I think this also, and finally, there is a question on the links with cohesion policy, but also with other policies, because the recovery facility is going to spend a lot of money, huge amount of money in the same territories, in the same regions, through the same administrations that are administering other policies. Cohesion policy, but not only cohesion, but there are national policies, national investment policies, common agricultural policy, etc., etc. How do we deal with coordination? What are the mechanisms that are embedded or that the Commission has designed to facilitate this coordination at the level of the member states and of their regions and at EU level, then in terms of assessing the achievements of their targets? And for Veronica and there is here, like, what is their experience on evidence on coordination across policies, because sometimes evaluation is really like about one policy, while we are interested more, how to say, in the general equilibrium effects. If we distribute with one hand in one direction, or if we try to achieve certain impacts with one policy and completely different impacts with the other, like we might end up with the sort of zero-sum game or just transferring resources across policies. So I was wondering how evaluation can help to minimize this type of effects. Thank you, Eric.
Again, many questions to which I do not have a convincing answer, I fear. I start indeed with also what Veronica has said before, the challenge, in fact, of setting the right, I mean, as we call it, milestones and targets, or let's say the right indicators. And I can just tell you, I mean, for administrations which are not used to doing this exercise, because again, they are expenditure based. I mean, yes, there were some programs in the past in cohesion policy which have used also some sort of indicators, but at the end of the day, this didn't determine the disbursement. So at the end of the day, you know, like you don't bother too much, you know, like if you do not meet your target, because what matters is that you're able to present a payment claim, a bill to the European Commission to be reimbursed. So therefore, there was obviously, when we started, there was not a lot of knowledge among public administrations how to deal with them. And for example, we had to guide, in fact, member states in the right direction. I mean, one of the member states where I wouldn't have expected this, because it's a member state which is quite, I mean, has a good, well-developed public administration. They proposed, because they wanted to have measures to support young people to enter the labor market, which is obviously very important, and which we, as a matter of principle, obviously support. But then basically as a target, basically they wanted to set the unemployment rate of young people in a certain year. And then I told them, well, no, this is not what you want to do. And then basically I was asked, but why not? And I said, because you don't want to use indicators which are beyond your control. You want obviously to use indicators if money is attached to it, which are under your control. So think, for example, about the number of young people who are, you know, like benefiting from training. This you can halfway at least control, but certainly not the youth unemployment rate or so, because who knows what it will be in 23 or 24. So this is nonsense. And again, I mean, this was, I think, quite a difficult exercise, because not only do you need to identify the right indicator, you also need to set the bar. I mean, you know, like you need to say, I mean, how many people am I going to train? I mean, how many kilometers of rail am I going to build? How many? You see what I mean? So it is quite a challenging exercise, and I'm very curious to find out, you know, like whether we got it halfway right setting these targets or not. I cannot say. I mean, we obviously, for some investments, what we did in a sense was a bit, you know, like to look at the average costs, because we know roughly what a training course, for example, in France costs. So we can obviously, but this obviously you can only do for a subset of investments, because I mean there are so many investments where this is completely unclear or so. So that will be certainly a challenge. This takes me to your second point on the question of transparency and monitoring and reporting. I mean, clearly, member states don't like it. I mean, let's be honest among ourselves. This is cumbersome, it costs money, it takes time. We had a lengthy discussion with member states about at least reporting on a common set, and I think we proposed 15 indicators, so that basically all member states are obliged at least on 15 indicators to report to the Commission. And basically, if it were up to member states, the reply would have been 0. Because we don't want to do this. Now, I think at the end of the day, we were able to convince them. There will be a website. It's the RRF scoreboard, which is supposed to go online by the end of the year. And there, hopefully, you find for all plans and as I said, for at least for a number of indicators, also common indicators where you can then see a bit kind of open data, like you have it under cohesion policy. Where do we stand in terms of implementation? What is the progress on different investments and reforms? But clearly, this is an issue, and I think this was also mentioned by Henry, where, you know, like, I mean, civil servants and politicians are not really very keen to embark on. So it's always a challenge, and it probably will also be a challenge in the years to come to make sure that we have sufficient evidence to track this. Now, last point, sorry for speaking too so long, but just last point, because this was asked, so how are we going to monitor this? We are going to monitor this, I mean, by really being on the ground a lot. We basically, I mean, want to have basically at least once or twice a month meetings where member states are supposed to report on us. They're legally obliged to report twice a year on the progress. And before they submit a payment claim, within each payment claim, there's a number of milestones and targets, and we will obviously check in the run-up of such a payment claim whether member states are still on track or whether we see already deviations. And as you can imagine, in particular on the difficult reforms, think about pension reform, we already see at this stage that, I mean, sometimes what is promised, we are not so sure anymore whether you know, like everything has been or is on track to be fulfilled once the member state is supposed to come and ask for reimbursement from the Commission. Stop here.
Thanks, Eric. Veronica, please.
Yeah, I think there's a real challenge here, which is how are we going to evaluate what the recovery and resilience programs achieve? Because they will build the railway, they will train the young people, but what actually changes as a result? That I think is someplace we will need the evaluators to help. And I think it's good that we will have some of the data, the scoreboard, etc. But what is the change that is brought about? You asked Riccardo about the issue about evidence of coordination across policies, and there maybe I'll talk a little bit very briefly about what it is the Commission has in place as an evaluation requirement. So the Commission has something they call fitness checks, and the idea is that you take, and it's more for legislative programs, but you take linked legislation at a certain point in time and you evaluate it all together after it's been implemented for some time in the member states. And there you assess, okay, are we over-regulating? Are there gaps or whatever? So I think that's a very useful kind of evaluation, and maybe we could draw inspiration from that. I must say, in the work that we're doing at the moment, where we're looking at the impact assessments of future Commission policies, the issue for the last year for us has been coherence. Because if you're legislating in different areas, you need to make sure that it all fits together. You're not over-regulating, and that you understand how, if you intervene in one area, how that may impact another policy that you have. And I think that goes for spending programs as well. So I think maybe we need to think a little bit more about how to evaluate not at the overall policy sense. And that, I think, will be a challenge for the recovery and resilience programs. Thanks.
Thanks, Veronica. Henry.
Sorry, trying to unmute myself. Yeah, coordination is one of these things where it's, you know, motherhood and apple pie, right? I mean, we sort of know it's good. It's another one of these which is all about, you know, how you get there. My feeling is that baby steps. I still think that it's like, let's get the monitoring and evaluation for specific components of the project and program spend in place, and worry about, you know, evaluating, you know, coordination and other kind of things, because it's really difficult. So, I mean, at least get in place monitoring and evaluation for the individual project and program elements, because there, I think someone said that's an important part of public sector reform, and I think it is. I mean, specifically on the recovery fund, I think the real challenge is I wouldn't be doing it on broad area aggregates. You know, because we've just had a massive shock to the economy, you know, as a result of COVID, and all the broad sector, all the broad area averages is going to get swamped. We've either got to go small spatial scales, or we've got to go individual level data on spend. I mean, I think that's the only two ways we'll really figure out what the actual, you know, for future learning, you know, what the impact of these things has been. I'm less talking about, you know, what we might do at monitoring and evaluation levels. And I should say there, I mean, the reason why I emphasize that just the challenge of then making sure we do some stuff, you know, on the policy and projects, is that we did recently have an exercise of looking how many local governments in Britain are currently doing have published evaluations that would meet our impact criteria in the last 5 years, and the answer was 0. So, you know, it's there's a long way to go with just sort of getting the basic sort of stuff in place, you know, and the efforts that Eric and Veronica and others that believe in it within the sort of commission and machinery of government are doing to sort of try to drive those reforms out, you know, are crucially important, because actually if you just leave it to the local areas, I'm afraid that the people who believe in that mission within those local areas nearly always get destroyed by the politics. So, you know, there really is a crucial role for some sort of top down to try and support people in local government who believe in more evidence use, because it's so easy for politics to swamp what happens at the local level, and they need, you know, they need champions and friends who are helping them make the case.
Thank you, Eric. Our time is up. Let me thank you again, Eric, Veronica, Overman, for their inspiring talks and for this very, very, very interesting conversation and debate. I think everyone has enjoyed the session. Some of the questions have remained unanswered, but we will follow up. But please stay tuned, stay with us. We have a short break to allow everyone to take a coffee. Please make use of the social area on the platform where you can meet up other participants and some of the speakers. And stay with us for the session that is going to start at 11:50 Central European time on digital and green transitions in Europe, where a very interesting papers will be presented, academic papers on the transitions, digital, green, governance, and inclusion. So stay with us, but join me in thanking again our speakers for this incredibly engaging and interesting event. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you all.